Hi, students. Welcome to our next lecture on theory. Today we're talking about Karl Marx. And my idea is to introduce Marx to you by explaining this really important concept that Marx creates called surplus value. Okay, so let's do it. Let's talk about surplus value. Now we have to remember that Marx, although too seasoned capitalist, he doesn't seem that groundbreaking. But when Marx was first writing, nobody had really explained how capitalism works before. So it was a pretty big deal for Marx to come along and more or less explain how capitalism works. The best tool to do that Marx developed is this idea of surplus value. So I'm going to draw us a little picture to kind of explain surplus value. Now, when we buy an item at the store, they're basically at least in a really simple understanding of capitalism, there are two costs that go into having that item available at a store. It's the cost of labor and the cost of materials. Now, no good capitalist would sell their item for just the cost of materials and labor. Let's say the labor costs 10 cents and the material, just to make this example easy, costs another 10 cents. We would never sell the item for 20 cents, right? Because then you're a terrible capitalist, you're not making any money, you'll go out of business. So instead, we sell the item at a higher price. Let's say for this made up item, we're going to sell it at 10 bucks. Seems like a reasonable markup, right? Okay, so this area here, the difference between the materials and the labor and the actual price point of $10, this is the surplus value. Okay. Now, what Marx spent a whole lot of time talking about is who gets that surplus value. And we all know, because we're seasoned capitalists, we know that the owner of the factory, the person who was in charge, the company, gets the surplus value. So owners, they get all of that markup. I wonder, in our discussion, I'd like to know how many of you work in retail and if you know what the markup is on the items that you're selling. It's usually a lot. This isn't that outrageous. And the owner of the factory gets all of that surplus value. So Marx kind of asks, like, why? Why would this happen? For one issue that Marx had is he thought that this was terribly unfair because the worker is the guy that's actually making the thing into a thing, right? Let's say it's a marker, right? The factory worker is taking the plastic, putting it together with the ink and all of that. He's making this have value. Before it was just a pile of plastic, right? And the worker came along, he did his job, and now there's something useful that the owner can make a lot of money on. Marx thought that was terribly unfair because the owner didn't really do anything, right? Like the owner didn't give the thing value. Only the laborer gives the thing value, but then they don't get all that surplus value. Right? So that ticked Marx off. He thought that was really unfair because workers are the ones creating things, and yet they don't get the money for all of the things that they produce or create. Okay, so Marx said that this only happens because these two people are in completely separate social groups, right? So we have Marx called the owners or the bourgeoisie. You do not need to know how to spell bourgeoisie. You don't even really need to know how to say it. I'm only saying it so that you can hear it and become familiar. So if somebody else says it to you, you'll know what they're talking about and you'll be super smart. So there's the owners, right? They're the rich people. They're the ones getting the surplus value. And then there's workers. Marx called those the proletariats. Again, you don't need to know how to spell it or really say it. Proletariat, just little, if you're ever on Jeopardy, you'll know what that word means now. Okay, so these two groups are completely separate. They have what Marx says, a conflict of interest. Conflict of interest. So what that means is that what is in the worker's best interest for wages to go up, right, is necessarily in the owner's disinterest. They want wages to go down, right? Now, the interesting thing about this is Marx realizes that these people do agree on a price, right? We all have a wage. We've all decided what our labor's worth, and we make contracts on that, and capitalism flows along. However, what Marx says is we're always in a state of conflict, right? So even when you agree, you still feel like you got a little cheated. A classic way to think about this is like buying a car. Okay, how many of you have done this where you go, you buy a car? Recently we bought a car and you could tell we wanted the damn car, right? We went in there, we were showing all of our cards, we played it terribly, right? But we wound up getting the car. It took forever, right? When we drove away, I said to my husband, I was like, man, I bet if we played that a little better, we could have got the price a little lower, right? And I was like, oh man, we should have done things a little different. We should have negotiated a little harder, whatever, right? But I am certain that inside the car dealership, the salesman was thinking the exact same thing, right? He was thinking, man, if I'd played that couple harder, I could have made a couple more $1,000s or whatever, right? So even though we agreed on a price for the car, we drove away, right? Both parties were kind of discontented or still in conflict about the price. We still wanted the price to be lower, and the car salesman, he still wanted the price to be higher, even after we had agreed, right? That's that conflict of interest that just necessarily is inherent to the relationship between owners and workers, right? And this creates two completely separate social groups. Okay, so that also means that a lot of the values or things that are good for one group are going to be bad for the other group, and things that are bad for one group are going to be good for the other group, and vice versa, right? So Marx, he kind of wondered, he thought at the poor guy, right? We need to hug Marx a little bit. He thought that if he explained all of this, if he explained surplus value to workers in factories, they'd be like, oh my gosh, like we're getting screwed. We need to organize. We need to revolt, right? He thought that would happen. And that capitalism would kind of evolve into something else, right? Because people would never allow themselves to be taken advantage in this way. Because remember, they give the item value, but then they only get a little bitty piece of the value. The owner gives the thing no value. They don't make the thing, right? And they get all that extra value. Marx thought for sure, if he explains this to people, remember, people didn't really understand capitalism. There was no real good explanation out there yet. If he explained this to people, people would revolt. Well, of course, we know capitalism's alive and well. It didn't happen. And Marx was frustrated by that. So he created this concept of ideology to try to explain what was going on there. Let's write ideology over here. An ideology is kind of like this mask that makes it hard for us to sometimes see what's happening behind the scenes in capitalism. It could be maybe something we use to distract ourselves, like binge watching television during the pandemic. Or it could be something like just not knowing what the markup is on items, right? Have you ever bought something and thought, well, I wonder if I could make that myself? And I wonder how much that would cost. We just don't know, right? Like I have no idea what the raw materials cost. Like what's steel out these days? I have no idea, right? So I just don't care. It's ideology, right? It's kind of masking the reality of this situation. Another thing that's kind of masking this situation is that we don't really think of ourselves as in two separate social groups in the United States, right? We have the middle class. We have, I know somebody who owns a business making all sorts of money, but I don't think of them as that different than me. Like, I think their values are just the same. Their interests are just the same as me. We don't really see class. We don't have a true class identity in the United States. And so we don't really see this conflict of interest in our day-to-day interactions. All of this really upset Marx, right? And I was going to say that a lot of times students read the Communist Manifesto. It's a short thing. You can read it super quick. And then they think they know all about Marx. And that's not the way it works. Marx was a prolific writer, and the manifesto is just an itty bitty piece. I like to think of it as like Marx had tried to explain all this. He did all this theoretical work. People didn't get it. People didn't care. And he finally got mad and he made a rant. And the manifesto is that rant. But there's a lot of good theory about how the economy works, how people work in relationship to one another inside of Marx's theories. So give them a chance. We're going to have part 2 where we're going to talk about another Marxist called Veblen. And we'll use Veblen sort of as our framework for the rest of the semester. So I'll see you in a little bit on part 2 of conflict theory.